So thank you, Allie. This is the first time we've sat down like this with an audience, so we're looking forward to it. I want to start by talking about the title of the show. I think that it was an amazing title. I mean, I love a poetic title anyway, but you know, with its reference to the geographical term, the angle of repose, but then the title of Stegner's book. How did you come to this title being what was going to represent your first solo presentation?
Well, a huge influence is that my dad, who is here, is a geologist, and I kind of knew that's a very big influence in my work, as is agriculture and industry of the Central Valley. When I was thinking about titles, I was asking both my dad and my brother about geological terms, because I think they have like an amazing poetic sound to them too. And we were throwing around these different ones that sounded kind of right, but not quite. And in that process, I remembered angle of repose, both because it is a technical term. I actually don't know, I mean, it applies to geology, but also agriculture, physics. It's the term for the steepest possible angle that loose earth can make as you're pouring it. But it also is the title of a novel which I really love and was very formative by Wallace Stegner. I read that novel before leaving for college. It was recommended to me by my grandmother, but I think almost everyone in my family has read it. I keep meeting people who I love who have read it and who say it's such a formative novel for them as well. And without spoiling it or saying too much, because I read it 10 years ago, it's been a while, the thing that still really sticks out to me is the way that that novel changed the way that I think about the past and memory. It's about a man who's going back through the letters that his grandmother wrote and then trying to kind of imagine what her life was like. So it's kind of about, to me, the impossibility of fully knowing another person across time, but also still trying to kind of do this impossible task. And I thought that was really beautiful.
Yeah, and can you talk, I want you to dig a little bit more into that. I want to hear about some of the parallels you found with your process, your artistic, creative process, and the novel, and reflection that you've had as you've been making work, and that after you decided on that.
I'm glad you're asking this question. I was chatting with my friends Josh and Harry this morning and came to a great realization about parallels, because I feel the book so much relates to my work, but I was having trouble thinking exactly how. And I was thinking how beautiful it was, this idea of trying to go back into an unknowable place. Like the past is this vast, expansive, unknowable place. And just a beautiful thing about the novel is how human the grandmother becomes. I mean, so much of the novel is actually told through a first-person account of her life, and she's just a human with complexity and emotion and depth. She's not a historical object. But this idea then of trying to go back into an unknowable place, like access the past, which is behind us and is inaccessible. I think to me it kind of reminds me of my idea of the underground and the drill pieces. The underground is kind of the conceptual thing that I like to think about in my work, and it relates to geology and some of these industrial references, but I have this symbol of the drill, and the drill can only go into the underground, right, kind of through one hole, like one access point, and you can only know a very particular part of like this vast unknowable thing that's all around us. That metaphor to me is always really connected to memory.
Yeah. You talk about place in that, and you use the term pictures of places when you're talking about this body of work specifically. How do you define place? You know, this body of work really started as very traditional landscapes with the bird. You are the bird, and now we have become the bird, the viewer's the bird instead of a stand-in for the artist. So how has your perspective of place shifted through this process?
Yeah, I mean, I think this change happened in the work first, and then kind of verbally or in writing second. The work, I kind of noticed that I was working with these symbols, like the symbol of the bird or the symbol of the drill, and in the painting especially, I wanted to see what would happen if I eschewed the symbols and if I could kind of still feel myself in it, which was scary, to let it go and still see if there was an identity or something to be said without the symbol. And so how I've been explaining it to people is that you can no longer see the symbol of the bird in these paintings because you are the bird. You know, you are flying, or that's your perspective. And there is something to that bird-like perception of place, like the distance of it. But then in these new landscapes, I think it gets jumbled too. They're abstractions, they're process-based, they come together over time, and memory and emotion plays into them. All of these things started seeping into these places so that they were not so clearly just a bird's eye view anymore. And as this all happened kind of just intuitively in the process of making things, but then when I actually sat down to write about the work for the show, which usually is a process that I don't really enjoy, it's very difficult for me, but I actually felt like it was very helpful this time because I knew always since the old work that I was interested in place, but I used to think of it very literally, like it's about this place or that place that I've been to in my life. And this time sitting down, I think I realized that place was a much more abstract container for all of these experiences and memories and things that seep into how you experience places or just being a person.
Yeah, do you think that has anything to do with, you were living in Bakersfield during the pandemic? I know you've been up in the Bay Area, and now you're back in Richmond, so place is a little more transient.
Yeah, it has changed. So I think that was part of it too. Like I didn't feel like it was maybe authentic to just be talking about one place anymore. Like I've moved around a lot in my life, and we've all have. It's not just me, So I think it made more sense to think about that term more expansively.
In your artist statement, you say that each work has to get lost before it's found, which I think is really interesting. Can you talk a little bit about the idea of displacement and uncertainty as you're making a piece, so technically, but then also conceptually?
Yeah. I guess technically to start, each of these pieces was initiated kind of without an end point in mind. A lot of them I started by just kind of making scratches onto the panel. That's also why they're wood panel and not canvas, is like I actually started a lot of them by pretty aggressively scratching with a palette knife into wet paint. And then just finding my way through it, which was very uncomfortable. Like I had many days in the studio where I was very frustrated and annoyed and like literally lost, right? And then I would somehow, just staying in the studio was uncomfortable because I was so frustrated. But then I would, and eventually, you turn the painting on its side enough times or put something down, just make a move and have an idea, and it would start to come together, and it was the most amazing feeling. And I think that for me, that kind of defines some element of, like, uncertainty is also just like an element of risk that I put into the painting to hopefully ultimately find the reward of locating a place, right? And maybe I mixed metaphors there, but what I'm saying is that I don't know where I'm going when I start, so I'm lost. And then as I go, it's kind of like finding your place. And then when I was writing my statement, I kind of realized that each painting, each picture is like a place that I arrived at. And I feel like it it brought back into that kind of conceptual idea, like that the pictures are places and the process of finding them is a process of self-location.
Yeah. Then when does the title come? After the piece is completed?
Usually, when I have to sit down, I know the piece is going to go out into the world, then I do the title. Sometimes the title comes really quickly and intuitively, but oftentimes I kind of have to sit myself down. And it's hard, right? Anytime you attach language to visual art, it's a tenuous thing. You never want to be overly explanatory. It's part of why I've enjoyed working with amazing writers at times, because there's a bit of distance. So titling works is difficult, but I pulled from most of the titles, at least of the big paintings, are kind of processes, places, things that kind of have agricultural, technical resonances. I like the crossover of technical and poetical in naming things.
Yeah. Crop duster, I feel like it's because it feels like such a finished piece. I mean, this one has a much more organic feel to Water Tower.
Yes.
It's really organic feel. The crop duster is this large piece in the back.
Yes.
It's one that people have been really attracted to. It feels like if I were to start this piece, it feels so fully realized and balanced in a very awkward way, but it's something you came to completely organically.
Yes.
Can you walk us through what the process of creating this piece was?
Yeah, so that piece, I start this one is nice. It has actually really warm underpainting. So, I get the panel, I gesso it, sand the gesso, put down some underpainting color of oil, and that one actually is a quite warm underpainting, which was different from how I'd done a lot of the other big ones. And then into the warm underpainting colors, when they're still wet, I take a palette knife and I just kind of expressively scratch these wispy scratches. And when the painting is that big, you get to really use your whole arm, which feels good. And I make art in between a teaching schedule, so I usually have a few days on and a couple days off, which actually works really nicely for my practice, because things in those days I take off while I'm teaching will dry, and then I can come back to them next week and add another layer. So the teaching balances, but I let that dry. I think when I started this painting, it was horizontal. I flip them a lot. With these ones, which was hard because they're wooden and heavy, and I was alone flipping it. And then I just would put things down. I'd put down a shape. I want to say I started at the center. I maybe started with one of those kind of like long horizontal shapes, and it was kind of just filling things in. I mean, what I love about crop duster is its sense of asymmetry, and I think I really like in this painting, there's a lot of kind of quiet space through the middle. I like that it's not all over. So compositionally, I felt like this one was quite successful. So I was doing things, I think I had a couple of really tough days. I have a bunch of photos of the process of this in my phone when it didn't look so good. But a big breakthrough I remember was the day that I thought to put that kind of like foggy middle section over some of the louder things and just quiet down the right parts and work on the sides and just give it that composition.
I think that, and that's what makes that piece so successful, are the moments of tension and in the release, and that one does it so well. It has this incredible balance. That's really kind of what I feel like this show is about, especially when you bring in the metalwork into the conversation. It's about these opposing forces. Can you talk about that a little bit more? And when you get to that point
of the tension and release specifically. Oh man, balance is such an important part of the work. Balance becomes quite literal with the sculptural work, of course. There's lots of curves, or kind of the tension of like curves in this case, where it's just resting on one point, or in the other piece, curves where there's kind of tension holding a bended object together. With sculpture, it's like pushing a material to its extreme, or playing with sensitivity and fragility of a very hard thing, which is steel, or being painterly or drawing in steel. With the paintings, you know, yeah, I do think there's tension and release, because, I mean, emotionally for me, the process of painting, there's tension and release because there's the bad days and the good days. And frankly, I will tell you, if I don't have the moment of feeling lost in a painting, I don't like the painting very much. And usually I change it if I get bored with it.
So it's about the moment of resolution.
Yeah, it kind of is. It's not necessarily that there needs to be struggle. I don't think that's how I would define it, but it's kind of like the uncertainty and the resolution means that you've really learned something. You've surprised yourself. And I love that feeling. I mean, that's also, I think, if I can kind of, I think that's why I'm invested in making abstraction right now. You know, in this contemporary time, there's so many different ways to make images. We consume so many different images. There are ways to now kind of automatically generate an image. But I think, like, my way of making pictures, like, you have to invest yourself into making the picture. And it takes time and patience. And so I kind of feel like that's still why abstraction is relevant, and like why these images feel human to me. Yeah.
As we just kind of started talking about the metal work, can you talk about how you approach a metal object, a sculpture, versus a painting?
It's a different process. Frankly, generally with metal sculptures, there tends to be more planning. It's not quite as freewheeling as the paintings. I sometimes wish I could change that, or I'm working maybe on it, but with the metal works, you know, I oftentimes will sketch out ideas in a sketchbook and then do various cardboard models just to work out scale and proportion. And then once I've got that kind of figured out, I'll think about how to actually fabricate it and put it together, which is very much a problem-solving oriented process. There's a lot that goes into that. And when I was doing metalwork totally alone, that process went very slowly because I was teaching myself, you know, so many parts of how to do things along the way. But for this show, I had assistance from a very experienced metalworker named Doc Scratchick, and that allowed me to learn a lot. Like, I now know how to do certain things that I can carry forward, but also just make things much more nicely, much more quickly than I would have before.
So, and then in the finished product, how do you feel the themes that you're exploring in this body of work manifest? Is it different end product for a painting versus
that's
sculpture?
A good question. I mean, I think that sculpture is about space. So there's fundamentally different concerns. In sculpture, I'm often thinking about how someone might move around something. Like, that's a very important thing for a lot of the floor sculptures in this show, is how does it look when you move around it. I'm really conscious of light. Like, I love, you know, putting the sculptures in different light situations, especially the perforated ones. It's so fun to see them at different times of day. So there's just those kind of like spatial light concerns. And the sculptures kind of referentially, they speak to, you know, different aspects of the Central Valley. I'd say pretty much every sculpture kind of begins from something recognizable, and then through the design process, I abstract it and put it in a different context. So,
yeah. I think that for me, it's like they do have a much closer relationship to the original objects of reference. So they're a little bit more overt in the way they communicate with the audience.
Yeah.
But I love what they do in the space to activate it as well. Let's talk a little bit about the fossil room. And maybe that's a good moment for us to talk about how the show is thematically laid out. Which is, as we've really been talking, you mentioned, you know, in this room that we're all in, We've become the bird. This is really kind of a focus on the landscape. And this is something that, as we were laying out the show, we talked about a lot. And so we really divided the work into 3 themes, this being an aerial view of the agricultural land, this second gallery being more of a cosmic understanding or ethereal response to the landscape, and then in the fossil room, really kind of exploring Allie's imagined underworld. So do you want to talk a little bit about the fossil room and how it came to be?
Sure. Well, the fossils are my name for these kind of smaller layered metal pieces that I've been doing since 2022. I started doing them because I was trying actually to be more painterly with metal and see if I could almost paint or draw with welds. So I was kind of welding just creative shapes onto a flat piece of metal. I realized that the heat colored the metal and created like this beautiful range of colors from this heat chemical process that I thought was very beautiful. And then I started kind of layering other pieces on top of that initial piece of metal to vignette the beautiful colors that the welds had created. And I started calling those pieces fossils. At first they were kind of material explorations of those colors and how to kind of showcase them. And I made lots. And then I went to a residency program in Mexico where there was a lot of critique and sharing of work. And I remember showing the pieces to Tal Frank, who is the founder of the residency, and she was like, well, if you're gonna call these fossils, you know, they really have to go on the floor. And I was like, right, that makes sense. So in Mexico, I made a few, but because of safety concerns, we were only really able to put one implanted into the floor and do kind of like the top layer out of floorboards. But I had always, since that time, had kind of a dream that I could do a whole room and that would be the ideal place to experience them, is looking down into them through the floor. So I approached Rachel and Henry with that idea around the time of this show. I thought it was a total pie in the sky, not attainable idea, and you both got really excited about it and said, let's go for it, we can do it, which was incredible to have that support. In that room, which I didn't even have the idea when we designed it until it was all set up, is that it kind of almost feels now like the mythology is connecting, and maybe the drill is the drill that drilled the fossils, and there's some causal, I don't know if you want to think about it that way, but I like the relationship that those pieces have with each other, the meaning that they take on in that room.
Yeah, and I love the mythology of the drill, and that actually, I think, connects to the rock cycle.
It does.
A bit. So, but before we welcome Josh and Harry up, I want you to conclude by talking about what your hope is for as people come into this space, and what, you know, there are such strong references to the Central Valley, not just in you know, color palette and the agricultural fields, the industry that's apparent, but also the titles. What is your hope as people come into this space and when they walk out? What do you want to stay with them?
It's really interesting. It's been fun to think about audience through the show and different audiences and people who might see it. I think I always want to speak to the Central Valley because that's where I come from, and there's so many shared references that people have, but I also hope that I could speak to an audience outside of the Central Valley. You know, everyone's invested in place and movement and self-location in some way. But the thing that I have realized that I would really like people to feel, that I hope people feel, is kind of the tightrope walk between enough that is familiar, that you might associate with, and then things that are still abstract, that might cause you to look at things in a new way, or that you don't necessarily know or recognize. So I hope people see something that they recognize, but also something that is new to them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.